Welcome back, everyone. So Matt Jackson is William D. Ebel Professor of Economics at Stanford University. He's an external faculty member of the Santa Fe Institute. His research interests include game theory, microeconomic theory, and the study of social and economic networks, on which he has published many articles, and the books, The Human Networks and Social and Economic Network. He also teaches an online course on networks and co-teaches 2 others on game theory. Matt is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of American Academy of Arts and Science, a fellow of Econometric Society, a Game Theory Society fellow, and Economic Theory fellow. Among many of his honors is a Guggenheim Fellowship, Social Choice and Welfare Prize, the von Neumann Award from Rack Laszlo College, an honorary doctorate from Aix-Marseille University, the B.E. Press Arrow Prize for Senior Economics, and teaching awards. He's president of Game Theory Society. Matt is going to talk about interacting regional policies in containing a disease. Thank you, Matt, for agreeing to speak, and we're looking forward to your talk. Okay, thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Everett. Great. So I'm going to talk about regional policies in containing a disease, and I'll start with a paper, recent paper with Arun Chandrasekhar, Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham, and Samuel Tao. And I'll also then at the end talk a bit about misinformation and disinformation instead of a disease. So there'll be some differences in terms of containing a disease and containing information, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I'll spend most of my time talking about disease and then a little bit at the end. So in terms of an introduction, I think the one important thing to emphasize is there's a lot of global problems that have huge externalities across political jurisdictions. So climate change, financial crises, misinformation, disinformation, pandemics, and optimal solutions require cooperation because the actions of one jurisdiction affect others. But jurisdictions act selfishly. They care about their own populations generally. And some of them don't even realize that they're actually involved in a game. And so that's caused problems. And we're going to talk a little bit about pandemics because that's a key example of this. And it's hard to control without vaccines or herd immunity. And so one of the things that's been used, especially in COVID-19, have been quarantines. But over the years, these have been used in cholera, diphtheria, typhoid, flus, polio, Ebola. So the list is quite long. And often these things are done when people react to infection rates within their own jurisdictions. And I think part of the problem here is that diseases don't respect borders. And I think if you look today, about a third of world GDP crosses borders. And if you look at supply chains, most supply chains in some way involve international trade. And then you look inside countries and things move back and forth across states and provinces. So it's very difficult to control the flow of things without having big costs on this. And so that's one of the big issues in trying to have quarantine policies. The other issue, especially with COVID-19, is that some diseases can be asymptomatic for some period of time, and you might also have low detection rates. And so when you put this together with interacting jurisdictions that are selfish and don't coordinate and only react to internal conditions or may even have lax policies, it can be quite suboptimal or inefficient in terms of the way that the disease is handled. And just in terms of some recent empirical observations, there's a nice paper by Cheng et al. That looks at, shows that countries that have a higher decentralization in terms of more jurisdictions and different interacting governments took longer to react to COVID-19, had more cases and deaths through the time period of their data set, and ended up having more local policies. There's also a recent paper by Holtz et al. That sort of shows that what happens in neighboring jurisdictions can affect behaviors within a given jurisdiction, and they put a sort of a loss of anarchy number on the issue and show that increases in the number of states and the amount of spillover. What we're going to do in this paper is actually think a little bit about how jurisdictional policies work, and we'll start by thinking about one jurisdiction. And in the background, there's always a possibility of having a global quarantine where you basically just put a halt to everything. that's quite costly in terms of economic and lost opportunities. So often what people do is have some sort of regional lockdown where you lock down around the infection. And so the first part we'll think about is how those work. And then we'll think about what happens when you have multiple jurisdictions that are acting on their own. And we can think of different types. So one is a myopic jurisdiction that only reacts to internal infections. Another is a proactive one that anticipates infection rates around it and anticipates its growth of infections before it actually sees them. And then there's a third, which is lax ones, which wait for a very high internal rate before they act. And in terms of an outline, what we'll talk about today is we'll start with regional lockdowns. So I'll go through some theory, a few theorems about this in a simple SIR kind of model, and show when they can actually work and what kinds of problems they have. Then we'll look at some simulations and give you some orders of magnitude on cost of leakage and detection delays. And then bring in jurisdictions and think about what happens when you have different jurisdictions trying to control the infection in their own rates. And there's going to be gains from being proactive and costs of having just a few lax jurisdictions that are going to be quite high. So let's start with the theory. And we'll start with a very simple setting. So just a network, think of these as people. N greater than 1, possibly directed. There's some initially infected node or a seed, and we'll track the infection away from that initial node. Let N sub k be the nodes that are distance k from that initial node, and N sub k, the little n sub k, the cardinality of that set. And we'll also track any particular node's descendants in this possibly directed network, so direct descendants, so the people that they can infect N sub j. And we'll think of a simple discrete time version of an SIR model. So if you saw Laurent's talk, this is just a standard Reed-Frost kind of model where you've got susceptible nodes. They can be infected by infected nodes, and then after some time period you recover and then can no longer be infected or transmit. Infected nodes in particular can infect others for some number of periods. We'll call that theta. Then they recover. And infections can happen with probability P in any period, IID, if there's an infected node and a neighbor is susceptible. So detection, we'll think of out of these theta periods, there might be some tau number of periods that you're contagious but not detectable. So asymptomatic, delays in testing, or people choosing not to test can all contribute to this sort of period of time. And this has been a big issue with COVID-19. But there's some time period out of these theta that you might be contagious and not detectable. And then also testing, once somebody is tested, we'll assume that there's some probability alpha of detection. So this is going to be the first period after this asymptomatic period ends, and somebody has symptoms, they could be tested. There's a probability alpha of actually detecting the infection. And this again could incorporate various things of whether or not people go to a doctor, what the quality of the test is, and so forth. Okay, and the kinds of policies we'll be thinking about are going to be ones where there's some radius k around an infected node, and then there's a trigger, which is you monitor nodes within that distance, and if you see at least X infected nodes pop up within that radius, then you'll lock down all the nodes within a distance of k plus 1 for theta periods. So given that people can only be contagious for theta periods, that's long enough to then stop the infection. Past that, if you detect all the infections within that radius of k, and k plus 1 accounts for the fact that by the time I actually impose the quarantine, one period will have elapsed, and possibly things could have gone out to distance k plus 1. Okay, and so you can think of, we'll think of whoever the policymaker is as having some knowledge of this network. Basically, we're giving them very good contact tracing, and they can trace interactions outward, so they have an idea of who the potential infected nodes are at some distance. And we'll talk about leakage and issues around that. But for the moment, think of them as having very good knowledge of this network. Okay. So the key question that we start with in terms of the theory is which kinds of networks allow for some kind of regional quarantine policy to actually work and halt the spread of a disease. So these policies have actually been fairly effective in Ebola. They haven't been very effective in COVID-19, and we can think a little bit about what the network structure has to look like and what kind of, what are the properties of the disease that allow you to stop things. And we'll give a characterization of that. And before I do that, I'm going to give you some intuitive arguments, and then we'll develop a condition that's going to come out of those. And the simple example, think of something with a reproduction number of about 3.5. So somewhere in the COVID variety. Let's think of a radius of 3 that we're working with, and a testing rate of about 0.1. So about 10% of the cases are actually detected in a reasonable time period. So if you had this kind of reproduction number, typically in a distance of 3, then you'd have, you'd expect to see around 58, 59 cases. The chance that they all go undetected with a 10% detection rate would be 0.9 to the 58.6. That's about 0.2%. So there's a pretty small chance that you wouldn't see this infection by the time it reached that boundary. And so if things worked in this typical way, you would catch the disease and be able to stop it. But let's suppose that there's parts of the network that don't operate in this typical 3.5 ratio, but instead suppose that what happened was, the first person was infected one other person, and they happened to infect one other person, and they infected one other person. So you just had 3 infections along a line. The chance that that's undetected is much higher, obviously. So here you have about a 70% chance of missing that. So the idea is that, if the expansion properties of the network are not even, and you have some parts that expand nicely and other parts that don't, it's possible for things to travel a longer distance in the parts of the network that don't have the nice expansion properties than the ones that do. And so the balanced network condition is going to say that you basically have to have some minimal amount of expansion in all parts of the network, or you're not going to be able to detect things, right? So, a network with sort of nice expansion properties, if we have a nice tree and things are expanding at a fairly good rate, if we have some initially infected node, we keep track of infections in terms of green, and reds are detections, with a 10% detection rate, by the time it gets out a distance 3, in this kind of structured network, you have a pretty high chance of seeing it, and then the quarantine is going to work fairly well. The alternative would be that if there's parts of the network that look much more like a line, here you get a chance where the infection actually escapes and gets out beyond the quarantine with low chance of being detected. And so the idea here is that if you have networks that have some parts that have these fairly bounded paths going out, and other parts that have good expansion properties, that there's going to be a non-trivial chance that the infection will escape the quarantine radius without being detected, and therefore the quarantine is not going to be effective. Okay. So the kinds of things that we're going to be working with is obviously sequences of large networks to say something probabilistic about the chances of stopping this. So think of some sequence of networks indexed by n. And one thing to emphasize here is, since we're just looking at the neighborhood structure, you can pretty much plug in whatever network you want here, and it'll fit into this analysis. And the growth balance condition that's going to be characterizing when these kinds of policies work is characterized by thinking about looking at a given node, and then thinking of paths that can go out some distance past k+1 to k+2. That's going to be a sequence of connected nodes that ends in this neighborhood beyond the quarantine boundary. And we'll say that there's bounded paths to that infection to distance k+2 if there exists some finite bound, such that for each network along the sequence, there's a path of potential infection to k+2 of length less than m, and with the neighborhood expansion of every one of the nodes along that sequence being less than m. So we have a bounded path length and we have bounded expansion of each of the nodes along that. And a sequence of nodes is growth balanced relative to some k if there's no bounded paths of potential infection. So if we have these kinds of bounds, then there's going to be a positive probability of escape, and without these paths, you won't get it. So if we consider a sequence of networks and some kind of regional policy with a trigger x and some radius k, such that each node in nk+1 has at least one descendant at distance k+2. So this is going to be the kinds of sequences we're considering. Think of associated diseases that have some testing detection rate and probability of transmission that are bounded between 0 and 1. So we can allow these to depend on the sequence, but we want them to be bounded away from 0 and 1. And let's start with a first theorem having no delay in detection and any period theta of how long people are infected. The first theorem then says that a regional quarantining policy of distance k and threshold x halts all infections past distance k+1 with a probability tending to 1 if and only if the sequence is growth balanced relative to k. So that growth balance condition is necessary and sufficient for some kind of regional targeted policy where you're trying to shut things down in some ball around an infected node. That's going to be the condition. This is going to tell you whether or not you're going to be able to do that on a given network. So a quick corollary of this, a regional policy is going to halt all diseases with a probability going to 1. You can plug in your favorite, random graph model or various kinds of graph, random or not. So block models, it's going to work if and only if the seed node's out degree is tending to infinity when raised to the kth power. Regular expander graphs. So actually one thing I didn't mention is you can allow k to depend on the sequence as well. So this has to go to infinity for regular expander graphs. D to the k has to go to infinity for regular lattice. D to the k has to go infinity, rewired lattices. So basically you have to have your degree raised to the kth power going to infinity. One interesting set of networks that fit a little differently into this than the others is if you're working with one with a scale-free distribution, then there's actually a non-trivial probability that you've got nodes with really low degree, with bounded degree. And those work if and only if you actually allow this neighborhood to go to infinity, which isn't, so that's not a typo, it's not d to the k anymore, it's actually k going to infinity. And so that's going to be a much more restricted class, and generally, these kinds of regional policies are not going to work in scale-free networks the way they work in others. This is probably a good point to pause and take any first questions.
Questions? Hey, Matt, I have a question.
Sure.
So I guess you probably will touch on that later. So you mentioned like some policy which effective for Ebola was not very effective for COVID-19. But the result you present here is just related to the network instead of to the disease itself. I was just curious, why, like, if we have this Ebola and the COVID-19 on the same network, why there's a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually two things. One I'll get to in a moment about the sort of detection rate. So Ebola is actually something where the symptoms are very strong and it's very easy to see them almost right away, so the detection rate's much higher. But I think that in terms of the network structure, with Ebola, we've been relatively lucky that it has erupted in areas of the world that are fairly remote and tend to be relatively easily closed off. So it hasn't hit in a major metropolitan area. And if it did strike in a major metropolitan area, you might see a very different network structure and one that's much more difficult to contain. So I think in the Ebola cases, it's been easy for them relatively, it's all in quotes, they've been working pretty hard, the WHO and others, to actually trace out the expansion paths and put a complete lockdown on those. And so I think that part of that is that there you can see the graph, you can see it pretty well, and these detection rates are very high. And so the probability of it escaping is fairly low.
I see. Thanks a lot.
I have a question. Sorry, somebody else have a question? Go ahead, John.
Oh, no, yeah, just a quick question. So in cases where the is mainly known but partially unknown, so if for example there's some probability that there's some edge I don't know about, it seems like that would affect the results in the sense that now things that have high growth rate, you're more likely to be missing paths than things with low growth rate, and which almost feels like it would sort of offset the effect that you're having with the increased detection ability in the areas of high growth rate. Is there some trade-off there?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And actually the third theorem I'm going to show you is going to address that exactly. So if there's a probability that I've misclassified nodes, and with these greater expansions there's an increased probability of that, then things are going to escape. And basically the third theorem is going to be a pretty negative theorem. It's going to say that in those kinds of settings, you've got a real problem in terms of having these things work. That's exactly right.
Got it. Thanks.
So I understand the general idea in terms of graphs, but in the context of COVID, for example, what do you think of as a node? I mean, what is the granularity at which you're modeling here, and what is the graph?
Yeah, so here this is a very granular model. So we're really thinking of these as people and modeling individual interactions. And so this would be, an idea of being able to trace out, from individuals how far things could have expanded, and so it's literally involving tracing technology and being able to check people within some distance k of an affected individual.
So distance k in terms of contact.
Exactly.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. So Matt, just building on that, Shrikant's question, assuming that, let's say, people are not traveling much, and then maybe a reasonable model could be something which is a combination of a regular lattice and an expander or click-like thing, which is locally it's expander / clickish, but globally it's more like a lattice. So where would that fit into this corollaries?
Yeah, and I think in these corollaries, in part of the problem, I think that fits more into the bottom category, which is that if you have ones that have some combination of dense parts where you're actually going to do fairly well at detecting, but then you've also got these occasional single paths that things can travel on. Those single paths allow for a lot of escape, and they allow for non-trivial probabilities that things jump a great distance in your graph and sort of escape outside of your K band. And so I think these first 4 bullet points in this corollary are models that we use often in network analysis because they're highly stylized and we can work with them, but they have fairly regular density patterns. And once you put in these situations where you've got very asymmetric density patterns, then you end up having to have a really, really large radius, or things are going to get out beyond it and you're not going to be able to control it.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, thanks. So I'll go on to detection delays now. And detection delays basically are a problem in containing things because you're allowing the spreading to go on, and you're not seeing things until they've traveled an extra number of hops. And so let's let some tau, now the tau being the number of periods that you have before you see the infection, allowing that to be positive, things are going to work as before, but now you have to sort of build in the fact that things could have gone an extra tau distance before you had a chance to put the brakes on things. And so, one way to do things is just increase the size of your quarantine net. So essentially, instead of quarantining everything in the K+1 radius, you just add in whatever your max on this delay is. If there's some distribution of the disease's latency across this 1 to tau, and that's going to still work. The theorem is easy corollary of theorem 1 is just the same thing holds if you sort of expand things out for some delay distance. and you still have this growth balance condition. You know, what's the problem with this? The problem with this is in a small worlds kind of graph, if we're already, you know, setting k at like 3, then we're out to 4, and now you put in some, you know, tau extra number of buffer zones, you begin to get into the 6, 7, 8 range. And in a small worlds, that means that you're quarantining quite extensively. So it's, you know, I wouldn't interpret this as a positive result, but it sort of says that you're going to have to expand out to account for that, and if you really want to be able to have these kinds of policies work completely effectively. So now let's get to the question that John was pointing at. Imagine that we have some fraction of nodes, epsilon n, of nodes within distance k of the original seed node that aren't included in the regional quarantine and are connected in fact to nodes outside of this quarantine area. And this could be for several reasons. And I'm going to get to this in more detail when we get to the jurisdictions, but the basic idea could be that this is misclassified, right? So either I don't detect them, or I can't find them, or there's people that I try and quarantine and they don't behave, or there's people that I can't, you know, there's you know, emergency responders or other kinds of people I can't control. So there could be a bunch of reasons, but for some reason there's some fraction epsilon n of nodes that can hop to other regions. The third theorem then says, if this epsilon is a very small order, so order 1 less than the number of nodes in the ball of, you know, distance k plus 1, or k, sorry, around the initial seed node, then, you know, things still work, but that's a tiny number. And basically, if epsilon n is above any positive constant, then you're going to have regional policies, these kinds of quarantine policies, fail. So it will fail to halt all infections past distance k plus 1 with a probability bounded away from 0 if either you fail the growth balance condition or this epsilon n gets large. And I think John had sort of the right trade-off in mind. You know, one thing you can think about is if you have better expansion properties, that makes it easier to detect infections and sort of shut them down. But the larger that set of nodes is, it's also the harder it is to control, and the more misclassification you have, and that gives you a higher probability of escaping. And so there's sort of a trade-off in sort of, you know, how rapidly you can detect things and how hard it is going to be to actually do the quarantining and have that be completely effective. Okay, so you know, these regional policies have problems. Just some quick simulations to sort of illustrate this. And these are just built, you know, calibrated to some data we had from West Bengal and then some US numbers. But what we did is just build a network on a sphere. So there's 40 locations that are located on a sphere, 3,500 nodes in each. We did this just because of limitations of actually running the model and doing simulations. They link to other nodes, and that probability decays with distance. So about 80%, and these were calibrated to the West Bengal travel data that we had. So these are, you know, most of your interactions within your own town or village, but occasionally you go to others. So 21% moves out, and then that probability decays with distance. Average degree in this network is about 20. Alpha is about 10%. 5 periods of infection, and the P was set to a reproduction number of about 3.5. Okay, so, you know, first theorem, in a world with no delay and no leaks, things work pretty well. So you can sort of just simulate over time. The red is sort of the infection over time, and then the blue is sort of the cumulative infection. So here, you know, you end up in terms of infection per million, fairly tiny infection rates. And it takes you, you know, with this network, it takes you a little bit of time to get things under control, but fairly rapidly, after a few quarantines, things are eradicated. Okay, now let's put in that 3 delay. So let's put in a 3-period delay so that 3 out of the 5 periods you're asymptomatic and you don't actually get detected until the 4th period of your infection. That changes the graph pretty dramatically. So now you get a much higher spike in initial infections and a much higher cumulative effect on the infections. And, you know, it does work with repeated quarantines to actually get things under control. but it takes a while, and you have these sort of second waves and third. If you put in leaks as well, then you end up having even a worse situation where you're going to be dealing with multiple infections and repeated quarantines for quite a while. And here you've got infections that are going to reach a much higher level per billion than the first two cases. Okay, so that's just to give you some feeling for this in terms of numbers. And now what I want to do is think about the jurisdictional issue that I started the motivation with, and I think is sort of what we've one of the main points of this paper. So we can think about jurisdictions, and let me just give you an idea. So let's imagine that this red node is the initially infected nodes. We've got these blue nodes at distance 1, green nodes at distance 2, black nodes at distance 3. We've got some distance 4 nodes and so forth. So if we try to do a regional policy and we're trying to detect things within one jurisdiction, then we can sort of draw a line around this and everything works nicely. The problem comes from the fact that these might not tessellate well with jurisdictional borders. So if we think about some of the interactions across this, if this network isn't all within one jurisdiction, but part of it falls in one jurisdiction and part of it falls in another, it's going to be difficult because this jurisdiction, the first jurisdiction on the on the left, is trying to deal with the infections that are rising there, and not able to lock down what's going on the right-hand side. Okay, and so what you can do is now think of the 40 different locations that we had in the original set of simulations. Instead of being controlled by just one actor that was working with the whole network, let's think of these as being 40 different jurisdictions that each only look at its own internal infection rates. And here we'll let the trigger be 1. So we'll look at quarantine policies where once you see an infection within your own jurisdiction, then you shut it down. You shut it down for 5 periods. And so if we can look at that, what we see is we will actually get a higher kind of infection rate than we would in the original policy where this was all run by one. So here, instead of in the few thousands, we're up into the hundreds of thousands. And so, we're getting a much higher overall infection rate and many more times of quarantining because these quarantines are going to be escaping across jurisdictional borders. And let me sort of mention the gains from being proactive here. And so one problem with this is that what happens is, if we go back to our picture of the jurisdictions, once the left jurisdiction is shutting down, the right jurisdiction should realize, or it should realize that it's been exposed as well. So if there's an infection discovered on the left, the right should realize that it's already exposed, and it should be proactive in shutting down as well. And if it shuts down before it actually sees an infection, it's going to be much more effective than if it sort of waits and then confirms that it's got an infection, given the fact that it's going to leak into other jurisdictions and it's also has some delay in seeing those infections. So what we see here is when we do things proactively, so that they, we actually in the model, what we do in the simulations is we give them the ability to estimate their own infection rate based on surrounding infection rates using the same model. So they sort of simulate the model, try and figure out what their own internal infection rate is before it pops up. And if they do that and react to those proactive numbers, they do much better than if they are completely myopic. So it's not as good as having one jurisdiction, but it's much better than the myopic ones. And the other thing I want to sort of point out is what happens when you have a few lax jurisdictions. So imagine now that what we do is we have not just these ones that are reacting to their own internals, but think of also having, say, a few Floridas in the mix. And actually what we did is we modeled these lax jurisdictions rates off of Florida. And so they're going to wait longer and wait for a fairly high infection rate, relatively high infection rate before they shut down internally. And so here, let's think of 36 myopic and 4 lax. So we're going to add in 4 of these slow to react and jurisdictions, what you end up is a much higher spike and much higher overall infection rates. And it's better if you're proactive, but this hurts the proactive as well. So if we sort of compare all four of these, once you're putting in the lax ones, the worst kind of world is having a few lax ones and everybody else being myopic. Being proactive can help, but having the lax hurts those relative to everybody being on at least proactive. And one thing to say is, this itself is worse than having just one jurisdiction or complete coordination across jurisdictions. So, you can sort of keep track of the overall quarantining rate over time. And what you see here is when you are proactive, it spikes faster, but then you have fewer time periods in which you're quarantined. The myopic ones, you're going to react slower, but you're going to end up with more quarantining. And the lax ones drive up the total quarantining of the whole society by just allowing the infection to brew there and then keep spreading it back to other jurisdictions. And so you're just playing whack-a-mole with these few lax ones that causes a great spread in the disease. So if you look overall, so you can track the trade-off here of infected person periods and quarantine person periods. So, the costs come in two flavors. One, how much are we shutting people down? And the other is what's the total infection rate? And the worst, you can sort of order these things. The worst of all is having a bunch of myopic and then 4 lax ones. You improve dramatically if you have proactive instead of myopic. And then if you can get rid of these lax ones, you do much better. And you're doing much better in terms of total infections. The best kinds of policies are ones with one jurisdiction where either you just globally shut things down or you follow some kind of regional policy where you sort of track the infections as you see them and try and close things down. But obviously here, there's great gains from coordination, and there's also great gains from being proactive. So in terms of lessons from this particular study, we get that regional quarantines require special networks to work. You need, this kind of balance condition in the growth patterns. They're hampered by detection delays and leakage. And one thing to emphasize here is the leakage can be tiny. So, small percentage leakage is a big problem in this kind of world. Proactive jurisdictions do a lot better than myopic ones, and a few lax jurisdictions are extremely costly. And just a couple of other lessons from this particular analysis. I think also, and part of the way we started this study was thinking about the fragility of models and predictions. So a lot of the models that we work with in terms of SIR and other kinds of models assume that there's a lot of control over things. And if you start thinking about leakage, delays, and different political control over different parts of a network, you end up with having very large challenges that can substantially hamper the effectiveness of various policies. And so cooperation across borders becomes essential. And I think one thing to sort of emphasize in terms of COVID is that, poorer countries where things are growing very rapidly are everyone's problem. I mean, those are, we're calling them lax, but those are situations where they can't control they don't have the resources and to control the infection rates, and that can come back to reinfecting the other areas. In terms of schools and businesses, it gives you an idea that having modular designs helps you cut that network into pieces that are easier to manage, and you can get an idea of how to basically structure those things in order for these kinds of policies to work. Maybe it's a good time to stop for any more questions on this.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I think this model has a lot of rich results, but it also incorporates quite multiple factors. Do you think, like, for example, the multiple waves is mainly because of the network structure, the modular, the granularity, or it's like people's reaction or the idiosyncrasy of the different players?
Yeah, just in terms of opinions on COVID, I think the lack of coordination across jurisdictions has been a big issue, a really big problem. And I think part of the reason that we're seeing, there's two main forces that are pushing towards repeated waves. One is the kinds of forces we're seeing in this model where you've got different jurisdictions, and then once you open up again, slowly things are going to start going up. And we're not going to eradicate this disease over time. It's still going to be there. And the bigger the pockets of it are in other places that you have contact with, the faster and bigger it's going to grow. The second is, this kind of model assumes that there's, even within these jurisdictions, there's some ability to say quarantine 95%, even if we have leakage, we can get people to shut down. In reality, the heterogeneity in people's behavior is quite large. It differs by age group, and there's all kinds of heterogeneities that we don't have here. And as we've seen with when universities try and come back together and you have a bunch of students getting together and going to parties, you see explosive growth in this. So I think there's a lot of issues that aren't built into this model that also affect these kinds of waves. But it gives you the idea that this kind of control needs a lot of shared information and a lot of cooperation across jurisdictions to work.
Other questions?
So I'll spend the last 15 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about containing information as opposed to diseases. So this has been, what are the difficulties in controlling a disease? And we saw that, it's very hard to control a network with disease. To some extent, it's easier to control information flows because you can actually control messages on platforms. And, there's still multiple jurisdictions that are in place, and here the multiple jurisdictions are all the different platforms on which we can be sharing information or forwarding messages. And I want to talk just briefly about a work I've been doing with Suraj Maladi and David McAdams, where we think about the noise and information flows here. And I think if you saw the quote in John Kleinberg's talk yesterday, that there's we rely on our peers, and we're getting information a lot from our peers, and this is about spreading information and getting noise through those. And fighting disinformation has become a big political issue. So you've seen Elizabeth Warren saying things about the safety of our democracy, needs tech companies to start dealing with these things, and taking real steps to fight disinformation. And then you have reactions from people like Mark Zuckerberg, who said, I don't think that Facebook or the internet platforms in general should be arbiters of truth. And I think censoring is problematic for a number of reasons. And one is that governments, privates, companies, crowdsourcing, they all have biases in them. And once you start going through and saying, okay, this is something that can be sent, this is something that can't be sent, it's very difficult to do that without injecting your own bias into making judgments. A second challenge is there's a huge volume of information that's traveling through these networks. And so again, part of what we're trying to do is contain misinformation, and in this case, let good information get through. And algorithms have a really hard time doing that. And one particular example of this is satire or humor. So if you train an algorithm to detect things, it's very difficult to detect when somebody's sending something along in satire that they don't really believe, and the person seeing it won't really believe it, and it's set for humorous purposes. So who's really to decide what's truth and what's false? And so one question is there a way to control the network itself in order to ensure better truth without policing the actual content? Oops, and that, okay, so let me just start with a world here where we've got some receiver, some listener here, and we've got a bunch of sources of information. And let's suppose that we're trying to decide between the state is either 0 or 1. There's climate change, or there isn't, or there's some fact that could be true or false, or some message that could be true or false. And so this person is trying to decide whether the world is 1 or 0. And let's suppose that the state starts out 1. Okay, and there's a bunch of sources out there of that information. What's going to happen is it's going to sort of filter through down to this person. And so, at different stages, what can happen is this stuff could mutate. So some of these messages might be perturbed. There's nice papers by Lada Adamic and others that have sort of look at how these memes and so forth get mutated over time. So a 1 could change to a 0. It could be that people just don't forward it. And so as things bounce along, by the time this person actually gets messages, collects messages from the original sources, some of them have been dropped. Some of them have switched to, from 1s to 0s. Some of them might have switched back and forth a few times. And the question becomes, how can we best control the tree without actually, controlling whether 1s or 0s are sent? So without actually looking inside the messages, maybe they're even encrypted. We just want to make sure that we're going to try and trim the tree in a way that can ensure the best learning by the person in the end. So we want to somehow control that. So think of a world where you've got a state of either 0 or 1, and you're trying to, the receiver's trying to determine this. Information can start, in any node with IID probability, and there's a probability P of dropping a message. In the paper, we actually deal with different probabilities of, maybe 1s get sent along with higher probability than 0s because you believe it more or something. But for now, let's just think of this as the same probability of dropping, whether it's a 0 or a 1. And then there's mutation rates. So there's some possibility that a 1 gets misinterpreted to a 0 or deliberately disinformed. So there's somebody in there who wants to send 0s and send 0s instead of 1s, and vice versa. There's people, 0s can become 1s, and there's people who only send message 1. So we can think of misinformation and disinformation. And those are captured through the fact that these messages can be going back and forth, and 1s could be sent as 0s or 0s could be sent as 1. And let's think of this receiver as having sort of a symmetric prior. So they're not sure what these rates of 0 and 1s are. They're not sure, so what the original state is. And think of it for today's talk as a probability of half. In a paper, we deal with a much richer model, but I think this is get the main points across. And so let's think of a simple example. So there's a probability 0.2 that you drop a message. And there's a probability 0.03 that a 1 changes to a 0, and a probability 0.1 that a 0 changes to a 1. So in this kind of world, basically what we have is an absorbing Markov chain where the absorbing state is that something gets dropped, but there's also a bias from 0s becoming 1s, a little more than 3 times as often as 1s becoming 0s. So you're going to tend to get more 1s than 0s in this world. So if the true state is 1, then having these messages filter down, most of them are going to end up as 1s and the receiver has no problem. But if the true state is 0s, then messages that travel too far are more likely to end up as 1s than 0s. And so the decision maker is going to be making mistakes more often. And in this case, you can actually just do an easy calculation to figure out what's the threshold at which at that distance, you're more likely to have this thing have switched over to a 1 than a 0 by the time it reaches the receiver. And for these parameters, it's about 7.5. Okay, so what we're worrying about is if in the state where it's really 0, what's the chance that they're getting mostly 1s? So one way we can sort of do that is we can just cap the tree. So if we cut the tree off at distance 7.5, then most of the messages are more likely to be true than false. Right? So I've got this tree and I can control its, let's think of now, I can control its depth. So I can chop the tree off and make sure that messages aren't going more than a certain distance. Then they won't have had as much chance to mutate and they're more likely to be true. And I could, cutting it at 7.5 in this example is enough to stop that, falsehood from dominating the truth. But one thing that's true in this world is the messages that started closer to the receiver are more likely to be true than the ones that started at a greater distance. So we'd like to sort of, maximize the relative size of the nearby messages to the far messages. And so the more we cut the tree, the fewer messages we get overall, but the closer we trim it, the higher the ratio of true to false. And so what you can do is you just go through, here's the tree depth that we cut it at, and depending on what the average degree is, so if we just look at a line, where I just have one person and then they talk to one person and so forth, if I'm just in a line, then the tree depth, the probability most signals are correct is pretty flat. But once you get to a much higher tree breadth, so if we get up to the 7 or 10 range, where we've now got a much, the tree is widening fairly rapidly, the farther we let things go, the higher the ratio of far away nodes to close nodes, right? So as we increase the breadth, then we're increasing the ratio of far nodes to close nodes, and the probability that most signals are correct starts to deteriorate the greater the depth. And so in these worlds, what we'd like to do is trim that tree to have shorter depth. Okay, so one problem is if you think about a platform, it's fairly easy for a platform to control how many people a given person forwards a message to. And in fact, we've seen WhatsApp and FaceTime put in these limits that you can only forward a message directly to 4 people or groups. Whereas it's harder to trace how many hops things have gone and trace where they came from. And so if it's difficult to control depth, then one thing you can do is control breadth. And the wider breadth basically increases the number of messages, but it also increases the ones that are from far versus near. And so actually narrowing the breadth is another way in which you can sort of increase the relative ratio of close to far messages. And so here for the same parameters is as a function of the tree depth, what's the probability that most signals are correct as a function of the tree breadth. So here what we're doing is just controlling how wide it is. And if the tree is fairly long and say it goes out to a distance of 10, then actually capping things in this case at 5 is an optimal thing. And if it's of depth 9, somewhere between 5 and 6. Whereas if it's a shorter, it has shorter depth, then you can actually allow for much wider breadth and not worry about those distance messages. And so you can go through and do simple calculations about what's the optimal cap in terms of making sure that more things are true than false. And that's going to depend on these relative ratios of moving back and forth between true and false, or between zeros and ones. And that's where that cap of 7.5 came from. You can do this calculation. It's fairly straightforward. And if you can't do that, then you can trim the breadth. And that's a similar kind of calculation. You can cap D at a given level, and then that ensures that most things will be true rather than false. And for the kinds of parameters we had in that example, that cap is about 4.6. And in fact, calibrating this roughly, but WhatsApp and Facebook recently capped things at 5. And the idea here is that narrows the tree and doesn't allow falsehoods to travel quite as far or things to mutate as much. And so you've got relatively shorter distances. There's more chances that the receiver's getting things that are going to be more true than false. In situations where these mutation rates are really different, so if you have a large amount of disinformation coming in terms of maybe ones compared to zeros, if there's a big asymmetry there and P is reasonably large, then it's sort of impossible to cap breadth and actually work. So there's some level at which it just can't work because you're going to be getting so much mutation and that in fact limiting things is not going to work. So I think just some quick messages from this. Limiting breadth and depth can increase average information quality without censorship, and I think that's very important to emphasize. Is if we want to get into making sure that people are making good decisions without censoring and getting into looking inside those messages, we can control the tree. And I think going back to the first talk, where we had jurisdictions controlling infections, Once you have, here in this world, it's not necessarily political jurisdictions, but it might be different platforms. So here, maybe you start limiting things on one platform, but people can send messages freely on another platform. That means that they might move to another platform, and that can still be spreading misinformation or disinformation. And so with overlapping or competing platforms without cooperation between those platforms, you have the same kinds of problems that we saw in the first paper. I think that's a pretty important issue. And one other thing that's sort of missing completely in both of these models is homophily in the networks. So the fact that people who might be like-minded or have similar opinions or sources of information in the information network, or have similar susceptibility or asymptomatic periods, or chances of testing positive in the disease network. So those are both, these are important issues. So you can find these papers on my website or SSRN or arXiv. They're both on arXiv as well. So that's a good place to stop and take any final questions.
Okay, that's excellent talk. Thank you, Matt. Matt, if I may ask a question.
Sure.
So in the first part, the policy, if I understood correctly, was while there's a parametric policy, that is, you could change the parameters, but policy was fixed and static. That is, across the network, across the nodes, it applied in the same manner.
Yeah.
Now, in reality, of course, like any other place, initially one is laxed about it, and as things become more and more prominent, one starts acting a lot more aggressively. Is there a possibility or room to think about in your model how such an adaptive policy might react? And if so, do you hope that this kind of an if and only of or equivalence characterization that you had with this balanced growth style condition would also naturally emerge?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think one thing we have already seen is that places that were somewhat myopic and lax have become a little more savvy over time. And once they saw infections hitting their own, now they have been monitoring activity a little bit more closely and understanding that things grow rapidly and that there's these delays. I think that, so that there is some adjustment of that over time. I think the counter to that is that over time, the populations also are, abiding by rules a little less. So you said protests popping, so you see a counter force, and they become more unruly and harder to control. And so I think optimally, we need an international organization to deal with these kinds of problems, and unfunding the WHO sort of moves us in exactly the wrong direction, right? So you need some organization telling people, look, you should be paying attention to this. We can give you forecasts. You should pay, and listening to the experts on their forecasts and their numbers, I think becomes essential.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Oh, John, go ahead.
Thanks. I was going to ask. So in the information scenario, it feels like there's an asymmetry in that you expect that the sort of true messages on a topic are somehow more constrained because they have to, be close to the truth, whereas the non-true messages might be more unconstrained. Is there some way to think about that in the context of the model, that somehow sort of there's more freedom of motion if you're mutating toward in the false direction than in the true direction?
Yeah, I think, one thing, so our model is very simple and just having these zeros and ones, and things can be bouncing back and forth. And so I think often things mutate to sort of garblings. And so one interpretation that sort of fits relatively well into this is that there's some nodes that they hear a zero, but for whatever reason, they just want to send a one. So that, the disinformation fits fairly well. The mutations and noise more often looks like the dropping of message. So I get a message that, was a one, but now it just doesn't make any sense anymore. My friend said they read some study and it said this and that, and then I can't interpret what they actually are saying. And I don't know what to conclude from it. So I drop, that's sort of more in the dropping. But I think, this model is very rudimentary, and it sort of, gives bounds on these things. And I think it shows some basic trade-offs, but the nuances of actually how these things mutate would be important in practice.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Hey Matt, thanks for this very interesting talk. So I have a question about the last part of your talk. So if the platform is limiting the breadth, then I think the malicious user may do is they will create lots of the bots account to spread the information at the same time. So like in your model, you assume all the information source are true source, like they're all ones. So you have mixed of ones and zeros. How that will impact the breadth? Like, have you looked at the trade-off of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things. One is, the way the model incorporates for the people who are not sending the true ones. So we assume that these things start out is just having building those into the mutation rate. So right away, somebody, just always sends a one, and how many of those nodes determines how quickly things become, switch from zeros to ones and so forth. The issue of people, creating new identities or, getting around these kinds of breadth issues, I think is a real one for platforms. But you could think of this as sort of an absolute ability to trim the tree. And in reality, what they do is if you can only send things to 5 messages, it just makes it much more costly for people to be broadcasting false. Now I have to I have to make more accounts, and I can only send a few at a time, and it just becomes more. So they're just increasing the cost rather than making it impossible. We sort of go to the extreme on that.
I see. Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Yeah.
Well, again, thank you, Matt, for a lovely talk, and claps in the virtual way.
Okay.
For all the audience, we'll be back in maybe 21 minutes with the last and final talk of the day.